Good morning, everybody. We are just waiting for everybody to join, and we'll get started shortly.
Hello, hello.
Oh, hi, Stephen. We're just starting, so we are live now. I'm going to get us going in a minute. Right. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this IETA live webinar. IETA live webinars are open to all, and it's fantastic to see such a huge cross-section of people from across the East and Central Europe joining us, as well as across a number of different industries today. You really are welcome, and it's super to have you with us. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on IETA.org a couple of days after the webinar, so do keep a lookout for it if you would like the copy. For those of you, in case you don't know who we are, IETA is a membership-based organization. We're a not-for-profit organization. Membership-based, we have well over 300 members from across the carbon market, buyers, project developers, service providers, sellers, etc. And our role is to track carbon markets all over the world and advocate for what good looks like in carbon markets. Now, the focus of this webinar today, and the reason we're having this webinar, is to focus on a number of studies on the demand side of the voluntary carbon market. These studies have been conducted in the last year, so they are all fairly recent and current. Some of them only published, only really going on live now in time for this event. So why are we doing that? Well, really, I think I'm speaking for all the panelists here when I say that as much as possible, we try to rely on data and on facts to inform the work that we do, the approaches that we take, the positioned papers that we take. And so this kind of modeling and research work is really important, but it is time consuming. It's difficult to do. Getting hold of the data, collecting the data is very resource intensive, and then finding ways to extrapolate that so it's relevant and we can draw sort of global conclusions from that work is really important. But it's quite often overlooked because, as is the nature of much of what we do these days, you grab a couple of headlines and move on. And so sometimes this really important analysis is quite overlooked. And so what we thought today was take a selection of studies and dip into them in a bit more detail. It's fair to say we really can't do full justice to the extent of work in an hour-and-a-half webinar, but we will be taking a fairly good look, and I hope providing enough of an overview so that if it is of interest to you, you can follow up, and we'll show you where the links are to all the studies in a minute. There are, of course, other studies, the ones that we're highlighting, and in fact, I was just reading one that We Mean Business released recently. This was more of a survey where they were finding that investments in credits catalyze action, and the lack of claims is really one of the key reasons for limiting carbon action. So there are these studies ongoing all the time, and it's really helpful to keep track of them. So perhaps just a final sort of bit of a health warning, just to remind everyone, these are studies. We're calling them studies. They're really modeling work. They're based on facts and then extrapolated. So please, when you look at the findings, always bear that in mind. This is never an exact science, but that's our best efforts to try and understand the market and to try and develop policies and position papers that are relevant for the direction we're heading in. I would like to also draw your attention to a new set of guidelines that IETA will be launching shortly. These guidelines are for the high integrity use of carbon credits in support of net zero delivery. And the research study that will be covered by Antonia was really the foundation of this work. We drew quite extensively on that piece of work. I'll speak more at the end of the webinar on where you can find the guidelines if you'd like to read up more about them. They were developed by IETA, by a task force in IETA, and they really are a task force of members who are deeply concerned about the pace of net zero delivery and what we can do to escalate that pace. So let me now move on to introducing our panel. And we have with us today, so I will be moderating the session for today. My name is Andrea Abrahams, and I am the Managing Director for Voluntary Carbon Markets at IETA. We have Mark Kenber, who's Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. Sorry, these acronyms always get one when you least expect it. And Mark will be covering some opening comments for us, as well as covering a statement at the end. Stephen Donofrio. Stephen was formerly Managing Director at Ecosystem Marketplace. Antonia Drummond, who's the Carbon Market Data Lead for AlliedOffsets. And James Griffin, who's Head of Corporate Data at MSCI, previously Trove. So everybody will be involved in the session, and I will now just explain the format of the session today with you. So first of all, we will have an introduction from Mark. We'll then have 3 presentations. Each presenter will explain their research study, so I won't do that here, but we'll have 3. They'll follow one after each other. Please enter your questions for these studies in the chat while they're underway, because we won't stop for questions while the presentations are on the go. After the presentations, we will then have a Q&A session, and that will be both addressing questions that have come in through the chat, as well as if you would like to raise your hand, we can unmute you and we will take your question directly. And then very finally, we would like to share with you a summary of the key points that have come out from across these studies. It's very brief. I think we ended up with 5 points only in the end, but there are points that we all agree with and therefore are, consistent across the studies. And those points we would very much like to take you through and give you an opportunity to access them on LinkedIn and share them. On the right-hand side of your screen is a link. That is a link to all the reports we'll be covering today. As I said, that's 3 in presentation 1 and a further 2 in presentation 2 and 3. So 5 reports in total. You can find them all on that link. I'm now going to pass on to Mark. Mark, over to you, please, if you will take us through your introductory comments.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you for having me on this webcast this morning. My name's Mark Kenber, and as Andrea said, I'm the Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, and our mission is to enable high-integrity voluntary carbon markets that drive deeper and faster emissions reductions while supporting broader sustainable development goals. I think, as we all know, we're facing multiple challenges currently in the context of climate change. Global emissions are still projected to rise by 3% above pre-industrial, above 1990 levels by 2030, when they should be 42% lower for us to be on a 1.5 degree pathway. So our emissions are still rising, haven't yet peaked, and are way off track from where they should be. Developing countries need 5 times as much finance as they're currently receiving. They need $2 trillion a year by 2030 if they are to make their net zero transition in accordance with their NDCs and the next round of NDCs that they'll be publishing next year. So we need a 5 times increase in climate finance if we're to meet those objectives. Bottom-up analysis of the reduction and removal opportunities across the world suggest that there are between 8 and 10 gigatons, that's almost a fifth of global emissions, which could be reduced and removed if the financing and the markets exist to drive that investment. So we have huge overproduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We are off track with our targets at the national level and at the corporate level. We are under financing the vast plethora of emission reductions and removals that are opportunity to us now, and which we need if we're going to get back on track with our emissions. So that brings us to a key question. We clearly need corporates to decarbonize as quickly and as deeply as they possibly can. We also need private sector investment through carbon markets and other avenues to take advantage of those emission reduction and removal opportunities that exist at a reasonable cost. So the key question, which we'll be looking at in part in this meeting, in this session today, is how do we combine those two? How do we incentivize deep decarbonization while also incentivizing investments through voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets more generally in a way that doesn't substitute for decarbonization, but works as an incentive so that we get deeper decarbonization and major investments through voluntary carbon markets that will catalyze additional capital, lead to the adoption of technologies that are not yet available, and drive down emissions as well. And what we're going to hear in the rest of the session today is a lot of analysis, as Andrea has mentioned, that will point out the opportunity and suggest ways in which we can answer that question satisfactorily. So I'll now hand back to Andrea, and we'll hear the presentations, and I will speak a bit more later in the session.
Thanks, Mark. Sobering indeed. Good to get that as a context for what we're about to discuss. So I'm now going to hand over to Stephen, and Stephen will start with presentation 1. Thanks, Stephen.
Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everybody. I'm based in New York City, so for me it's morning. But I guess just to start by thanking you, Andrea, and the whole IETA, ICROA teams for putting this webinar together. And also just to maybe start with some high-level comments and to complement what you said, Andrea, and also Mark, about the kind of the state that we're in and some of the recent studies that have come out since the reports that I'll mention in a moment. But I think the challenge that we're all facing is that this is a moment in time where we need to be very tight about our approaches to tackling climate change. We need to be very thorough and very robust, but we also need to make sure we're not excluding a climate solution, from our toolkit based on sentiment or perceived interests around the exact approach and which companies should do what and for what sequence. I think what we're seeing with the voluntary carbon market is that over the past 2 to 3 decades, there's been an evolution, but this evolution has come in pair with the evolution, broadly speaking, for corporate sustainability and responsible investing, as well as government policy that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 decades. There's been many recent reports that have been published in the previous 2 to 3 or 4 years to provide the backstop and the backbone for the growth in mandatory reporting around ESG from regulatory systems around the world. And a lot of that is because we're seeing now more than ever before, especially from the early days of the voluntary carbon market, that things like reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, climate risk, opportunities, things like that, those are now much more commonplace along major businesses than they ever have before. And I think when we look at the role of the voluntary carbon market, a lot of the criticisms start with a question of, are companies buying their way out of the problem? And in fact, this is maybe the wrong question. I think where we started from 2 to 3 decades ago, companies had much less understanding and awareness of the global picture around climate change. They also had much less of an understanding about their individual company's footprint, and also a very different understanding about what carbon credits were, as well as how much carbon credits could be a part of their climate solution strategy. So I think that is an important way that I try to look at this market evolution and the opportunities that it has for us. And then I think it's just, just lastly, before getting into the reports, there was another report just published by We Mean Business, ICE, Intercontinental Exchange, and Bain, which really kind of takes forward the reports that I'll mention, and showing how companies are actually very willing to engage in the VCM, and that engagement in the VCM will not distract or detract their efforts, but it in fact will make and enable companies to go further and faster in addressing climate change. So that's a report we're not fully covering here today, but it is worth highlighting again. Andrea mentioned it. And then finally, I think to say, a compliment to the thoughts here that this is an and moment. The World Meteorological Organization just produced another report in the last week or so, showing that global records were yet again broken, and in many cases smashed, for greenhouse gas levels, surface temperatures, ocean heat, acidification, sea level rise, Antarctic sea cover, and glacier retreat. I mean, the problem is only getting more and more challenging. While reports like this are incredibly important, they are overshadowed, unfortunately, by other reports and other comments about the need for us to not only continue but accelerate the use of fossil fuels and other climate impactful practices. So I think with that, I'll jump into this report, these three reports here that I'd like to talk about with the first slide. And really to start off, and as another introduction, I came from Ecosystem Marketplace, which is a program of forest trends. And prior to that, with the CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, and prior to that with the Chicago Climate Exchange. So I've been working in climate markets and corporate sustainability and responsible investing for about 2 decades. And over the course of that time, there's been a lot of consistent themes, consistent critiques, but also, as I mentioned, a huge evolution in our ability to assess and make an understanding around corporate strategies to tackle climate change, as well as the evolution of the voluntary carbon market. And when we ask these questions about how the VCM can play a role, it breaks down into a few kind of key areas, but of course there are more. And here we're just seeing that there's kind of a real understanding needed about if you are buying carbon credits as part of your climate strategy, is that, and how does it support a decarbonization strategy that really is about driving emission reductions down through investments in direct operations or indirect energy consumption, as well as by engaging with suppliers and value chains around reducing emissions and tackling climate action. And then, but kind of even first before that is the need for more standardization and understand and I guess not just awareness, but the disclosure and transparency of broader climate metrics from corporates, in addition to their carbon credit usage. And then there's I guess always consistent questions about, well, if you're an oil and gas company versus a consumer products company versus a services or technology company, what are the distinct sector-based pathways and strategies that could be implemented to getting there? And then lastly, I think in terms of highlighting some of the key questions here, question areas to look into are what are the project and credit preferences? And this is not just whether it's a forestry versus renewable energy project, but it's also understanding the standard being used, the antiquity of the credit, the methodology being applied to the project, the location of the credits in the project. So there's a lot of nuances within those preference interest areas that are worth understanding and exploring in more detail. But ultimately, the question here is, are companies avoiding their critical efforts and investments required to achieve climate goals by purchasing these carbon credits? Okay, so I'll jump into these 3 studies. And as Andrea mentioned, we won't really be able to deep dive fully, but the point here is to make sure that these reports aren't produced and then forgotten about. Also that they are able to be continued with future publications, future research, future investigations into this, because this is not a one and done. This is an ongoing effort to make sure we're staying on track to achieve climate goals. But the 3 reports here are from one from Silvera, which was really, I think, the first in the series. Trove, which is now MSCI, and we have a colleague here speaking from Trove, who's now with MSCI Climate Markets, and then also Ecosystem Marketplace, which is a nonprofit program of forest trends. Basically, they all found roughly the same high-level finding, which is that companies that are users of carbon credits, who are buying carbon credits for their own consumption, their own retirement benefit, those companies are leading when it comes to decarbonization, reducing emissions, and other corresponding metrics. So that's really important. And that may seem on the surface, well, if these different organizations are coming, finding the same outcomes, what are their data sources? And so I thought I'd highlight some of those data sources on the next slide. And as I talk about that, also to recognize that that these reports were all published completely independently of each other. The organizations did not engage with each other, as far as I know, at least while I was with Ecosystem Marketplace. So there is no kind of cross publication or cross research project influence in any way. So they really came to their own conclusions independently, using their own approaches. And so to talk quickly about the sources of buyer data, because I think this is a very important piece, and it aligns with the work that Mark and his team at VCMI are doing, to create more standardization, more consistency in how companies are reporting on their purchases. But that data is currently not very consistently offered by corporates, and it's not required in most cases. But there's kind of really 3 buckets here that we found when doing the research for Ecosystem Marketplace. But also, if you look at the methodologies of these for Silvera and Trove, that the general buckets are coming from from kind of corporate sustainability reporting and disclosures, whether they're self-managed, such as websites or sustainability reports. If we're familiar with Global Reporting Initiative, that framework, that's largely the basis. But those are less standardized approaches. There aren't really specific components there that require or even urge companies to report on their purchases of carbon credits. The CDP climate change disclosure, there is a specific question that companies are asked to complete when they submit their disclosures. However, it's not a very well incentivized question. So companies are not sort of forced, and there is no requirement to report on this question about what purchases or what origination they're doing for project-based carbon credits. But we did find that was the most complete in terms of having a global database of companies with a specific question for this data point. Then I think it's also important to recognize that the standards over the recent years have put in a column in their registry data on retirements that would allow for the project proponents to indicate who the retiree is or who the beneficiary is of that retirement. It is not a required field, and so you do see that data, but many times it's left blank or it's generalized. But where that information is provided, we do see some good alignment between what we see in the registry data, and then companies are also reporting that in their sustainability reporting and disclosures. And then the research organizations, I could speak for Ecosystem Marketplace. When we would ask companies or organizations to report their sales of carbon credits, we would also ask them to provide their buyer details. It is confidentially reported, so those individual names are not provided publicly. But there are ways that these research organizations can come to that buyer information. So hopefully that's helpful in giving a kind of an understanding of the kind of current landscape of buyer data. But what we're seeing in the potential new opportunities here with VCMI, providing more of the framework of if you're corporate, here's what we need to see about the purchases of carbon credits in addition to the larger decarbonization metrics. Then that will hopefully open up opportunities for better transparency in the public space. We're also seeing things like legislations coming out from California that will offer companies to be more specific and more public about their purchasing. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to improve the quality of publicly available data around this. Let's kind of jump into these report findings. And again, I'll be fairly brief. The intent here is to maybe just highlight a few of the kind of key findings and show some consistency across these reports, but really urge you to go to the link that was provided in that QR code, or I think the team here is providing it in the chat as well. But there are some distinctions. The Silvera report, which ultimately found that companies that reduce an offset cut more emissions than those that don't. They looked at 9 years of data, 2013 to 2021, and specifically honed in on 102 total companies. The 51 corporate users of credits were selected based on which companies retired the most credits and those companies that had the highest revenue by sector. So they honed in on a kind of very specific scope, and of those 102 companies, 51 were users and 51 companies were not users of carbon credits. But of those companies, those that are buying carbon credits to reduce their or to offset are reducing more scope 1 and 2 emissions at 6.2% than those that are solely focusing on emissions reductions, which was around about 4%. So that's really important, that we see in this first report that was published a connection between the companies that are buying carbon credits for their use and their percentage reductions annually that are higher than the companies that are not buying carbon credits. That's a consistent theme across these reports. What they also highlighted are a couple of two other kind of key findings here that are worth looking into further in their report, which is that the investment in carbon credits coincides with a 2x rate of emission reductions. So that links back to the 6.2% being greater than those companies that are not buying carbon credits. But it is important to see that the investment into carbon markets is not distracting or not taking away money that would be invested in emission reduction activities within the value chain. And in fact, the report that just came out from We Mean Business and Bain and ICE further accentuated that point that actually this is a budget that is dedicated, to VCM activities, and if it's not going to be used to VCM activities, then it'll be, brought back in and used for other purposes. But it isn't an either or using for direct emission reduction activities versus VCM activities. And then the last, and I think this is something that the different reports talk about, are that the different sectors have different rates of decarbonization, and most of these reports all really highlight that the services sector lead the pack. So just to go to the next report, which is from Trove, now as I mentioned, MSCI, found that at the high level, companies that are material users of carbon credits decarbonize twice as fast as those that do not use carbon credits. And that data is based on 6 years, 2017 to 2022, so slightly different year compilation of data set. A much larger kind of starting base of companies of over 4,100. But then within those, they found, looked into, I think it was just over 350 companies who are users of carbon credits. And that material definition is interesting, that they have to have purchased for use at least 100 tons of carbon credits and at least 5% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So there's some clear kind of correlations here between the reports around those material users decarbonizing or reducing their emissions faster than those that do not. So despite the different sample sets, same conclusion there. That they also looked at kind of more kind of distinct elements here around like heavier users of carbon credits, so larger volume buyers versus those lighter users, and that the larger volume buyers are decarbonizing faster than those lighter buyers. And then also that they applied some price forecasting based on an AI tool that they have. And while the kind of current price conditions were closer to around $5 to $6 or $7 a ton, they used around a $30 a ton price point. But they were able to apply also their quality criteria around the project types and projects, specific, I guess, specifications to determine that the users of high integrity, and this is according to their methodology, and higher price credits are reducing emissions faster than the lower quality or lower integrity priced projects and credits. So really interesting analysis there, and really worth looking into the details of that data and more specificity. And then the last report here I'll briefly touch on is the Ecosystem Marketplace report, which pulled in exclusively CDP data and looked at the entire universe of corporate disclosures, which was just over 7,400 companies. It was 1 year of data or 1 year of disclosure reporting, but those companies also provide historical data years around their greenhouse gas emissions. So it was 2022 disclosures for 2021, but it also did include 2020 and in some cases prior years. And when we looked at that data set, we distinguished between the compliance market participants and exclusively looked at voluntary buyers and excluded originators also from the majority of this analysis, because it was unclear whether or not they were originating for their own purpose or buying credits from the market. But again, we looked at a lot of different metrics to be able to really understand from the continuum of a climate change action plan of awareness and discovery around their climate footprint, climate impacts, climate risk, to awareness and governance, so having board level engagement, value chain management, to investment into emission reduction activities and such as more of the decarbonization perspective, and as well as understanding the targets that are being set by companies, and that there's much more kind of frequency of all of these factors in companies that are buying carbon credits and using carbon credits for their climate goals versus those companies that are not. Now, of course, if you look at these numbers across these different reports, we're looking at a much smaller universe of companies that are buying carbon credits to the global kind of nature of companies. There are thousands and thousands of companies out there who are not buying carbon credits, or at least not reporting that they're buying carbon credits. And so this generally tends us to kind of believe that these companies that are buying carbon credits are further along in implementing their climate strategies. And the results of the data show that because all of these metrics are being hit, that they're more likely to have board level of engagement around climate change. They're more likely to have science-based targets or approved science-based targets and various other goals that are being implemented by the carbon credit buyers than those that are not buying carbon credits. That it is kind of showing that it is the company leaders around climate change that are buying carbon credits versus the laggards. Now, of course, there are some individual outliers in that, but generally speaking, that's what these reports are finding. So I'll leave it there. I think I've taken up plenty of time, but I wanted to provide that overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was incredibly comprehensive. We are running a little late, so if you need a top-up of water or tea, now's the time to dash off and get that, because we're going to move straight on with Antonia's presentation. That should be about between sort of 13 and 15 minutes. So, Antonia, I will now hand over to you for presentation 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everybody. My name is Antonia Drummond, and I am the data lead at AlliedOffsets. For those of you who don't know us, we are a data and analytics firm focused on the voluntary carbon market activity. So we have a data set across 24 voluntary registries plus non-registered CDR projects, and we track project activity, including credit prices, buyers, intermediaries, activity, and market trends. So we can just get into the slides, please. So we were commissioned by IETA to understand what a high integrity use case of carbon credits might be. So, I mean, as we're all aware, there's increasing need to understand how carbon offsetting can contribute to companies' overall decarbonization strategies. And the way that we approached this was to first understand just how much carbon dioxide are these companies emitting, what % of emissions are covered by a reduction target, and then what that might mean for the voluntary carbon market. So the findings in this report are meant to inform market participants, sustainability officers, policymakers for the potential for the VCM to help reduce and remove carbon emissions globally. So if we can move on. Yes, thanks. So our approach, we estimated emissions for approximately 6,400 companies, and these are the largest listed companies by market cap. And the findings that I'm going to discuss today are based off of this extrapolated data set. So the way that we estimated these emissions, we used our AlliedOffsets data set on company emissions and created a model to estimate baseline emissions for all companies based off of their sector, so their type of activities, and then the size of the companies, things like annual revenue and number of employees. With this, you'll see that scope 1 and 2 emissions cover around 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide or TCO2 equivalents. And then scope 3 emissions are largely double, triple counted. So we took this decision after various conversations where we did not want to consider, or we didn't, because companies often are not required to consider how their scope 3 emissions might be double counted, we decided to base it based off of companies' carbon accounting. So we then forecasted decarbonization trajectories for the companies as follows. So if we found them within SBTI targets, we forecasted 50% reduction by 2030, 90% reduction by 2050 of their baseline emissions. And for net zero commitments, just 100% decarbonization by 2050. And if they did not have a target, no emissions reductions. Move on to the next slide, please. So of course, all modeling, as Andrea mentioned at the start of this session, will have limitations. So just going over some of the limitations within this, it's based off of a data set where the emissions are estimates. We used a training data set of a sample of 22 gigatons, and that represents about 25% of the total extrapolated data set. Additionally, the pathways that we modeled for decarbonization are based on a linear reduction model, and in reality, decarbonization may occur at varying rates. However, while no modeling obviously can predict the future exactly, we still believe that this exercise is very useful to understand the challenges in terms of global GHG reductions, and then the potential role of the voluntary carbon market in aiding decarbonization. So just go into our findings. I think the most key message here is that 81% of these companies have not even set climate targets at all. So of those 11 gigatons of scope 1 and 2 emissions, 7.5 are not covered by a target. If we can move into the next slide, just give a little bit more detail about what this means. Unless more companies set targets, we estimate that additional emissions above a Paris pathway could total up to 4 gigatons by 2030 just for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and 6 gigatons by 2050. And that is assuming that all companies are actually meeting their targets. So for companies to get on track with Paris-aligned targets, corporate ambition would really need to increase by 2 to 3 times what it is now. We can move on to the next slide, please. So yeah, so that was all based off of the assumption that companies will actually meet their targets, but we have found evidence that even companies that have set targets are at risk of missing them. And we find that this risk is actually greatest for scope 3 emissions. Go to the next slide, we can go into how we actually calculated this. So we looked at historic emissions based off of the AlliedOffsets sample, compared to emissions trajectory needed to meet targets from a baseline. And we found that on aggregate, our sample of companies were off track to meet scope 1 and 2 emissions targets by around 26% of emission volume, and scope 3 targets by 62%, which is quite significant when you consider the volume of scope 3 emissions. So again, what this means in terms of actual emissions is that amongst companies who have set targets, which is still only around 20% of them, we predict their emissions to be 4.5 gigatons above the target in 2030. And the table's a little bit cut off there at the bottom, but as you can see, that a really significant proportion of that is to do with scope 3 emissions. So while it is extremely important for more companies to increase their climate ambition, even if all companies were to set Paris-aligned targets, there would still be a risk of missing them, particularly around scope 3 emissions. So if we can move on to the next section, I just want to talk about some work that we did around hard-to-abate sectors, because these are the sectors that are probably at greatest risk for missing targets, should they set them. So we built on work by the Mission Possible Partnership, who defines hard-to-abate sectors as those relating to heavy industry and transport. And we extrapolated some general potential emissions trajectories for these groups in our extrapolated data set, and found that depending on what type of trajectory they follow, the gap, even if they were to implement various decarbonization measures, could still be between 2.5 to 7.5 gigatons by 2030. When compared to a Paris-aligned pathway. So just go through the next few slides to show what this means. So these are and I think just really focus on the shape of these graphs to understand what I'm talking about. So the first line here is just a business as usual trajectory. So this is assuming that companies are just going to continue to make decisions based off of what is economically advantageous and not prioritize decarbonization. The next one is what we group as a low-cost decarbonization trajectory. So in this case, the cost of carbon is brought into business decisions and readily available decarbonization technologies are used, but and that you can also increase ambition by the fastest abatement trajectory, which is the next slide, which assumes additional availability of renewable energy sources and that companies will always use the best available technologies regardless of cost, which I think we can probably agree is not necessarily the most likely scenario, although it is possible. And then we applied a Paris trajectory on top of this and found that, next slide, please, that there is still a gap, even in a fastest abatement scenario, and definitely a gap within a low cost or business as usual scenario. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Again, just reiterating that there is significant challenge for these sectors to reach a Paris pathway, and then the gap for those sectors, if we assume that the extrapolated data set could go along similar decarbonization trajectories, even for fastest abatement could be 2.5 gigatons of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2030. And in a low cost scenario, that could reach up to 7.5 gigatons. So just moving on to the last slide, I've gotten through them a bit quicker than expected, so maybe we can kind of make up some time, but accounting for all of this information and the modeling that we did over the last few months, I think the most pressing concern that we really need to focus on is just the number of companies that have not set emission reduction targets and what that might mean as we get closer to 2030 to 2050. At no point do we want to suggest that credit should be a substitute for decarbonization, but potentially they could lower the barrier for entry and make it a little bit less daunting for companies to start thinking about decarbonization. There's also an opportunity for carbon credits to help mitigate excess emissions from missed targets in cases where it is just not feasibly possible for companies to decarbonize at the rates that would be required for Paris alignment. And that is particularly relevant when we think of hard to abate sectors and scope 3 emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia, and thanks for going a little bit quicker to help us catch up there. This has been a fascinating piece of work to do with Allied, and I really think where we can collaborate and work with other data sets like the Mission Possible Partnership data set and combine that with your data set and then sort of do the extrapolations, it just becomes a very rich piece of analysis. And I think also looking at the historic rate at which companies who have set pathways are in aggregate missing those pathways, and then trying to understand, well, could that rate of underdelivery continue going forward, which is pretty alarming, but there is that likelihood. And then, posing the question, could carbon markets help to prevent that from happening? So I think that use case analysis has really been very interesting. So just a reminder, questions in the Q&A function down at the bottom, and we will take them straight after this next presentation from James.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Is it possible for me to take control of the slides? Let's try that. No.
I don't know that
I don't know. Okay, well, I'll have to ask to click as well, because I've got a few bits of animation. But anyway, I'll try and catch up some time for us as well. My name's James Griffiths.
Well, so don't need to go too fast, James.
Okay, fine. Thanks. So my name's James Griffiths, and I lead the corporate data team at MSCI Carbon Markets. You might know MSCI for their climate offering, if not their original ESG or index businesses. But you also might know us, or formerly have known us as Trove Research, which was our name up until acquisition towards the end of last year. Slide, please. Thanks, and one more. Another one, please. Our mission is to provide investment grade data across carbon markets. So that's on the supply side for developers and traders, on the demand side for corporates, and importantly, for the whole of the investment community that sits around that. Something I think we did well, even as Trove standalone, was the width of our offering. I won't go through all of this, but just a quick flavour of what we're drawing on. We do integrity assessments for carbon credit projects. We have pricing, forecasting of future credit prices and market size. Our policy team synthesizes all the guidance in the space. And what I'll be drawing on in particular here is our corporate data set, looking at emissions, climate targets, credit use across a big universe. So big wide offering, and as part of MSCI, that's expanded further. Their climate offering includes things like physical risk, transition risks and opportunities, financial data, and so on. So click, please. Building on this, we do lots of research, some of which is public facing. A few things from last year that I think particularly got some good recognition in the industry. First one was our emissions versus credit use report, which Stephen explained at length. So thanks, Stephen, for that. We did a report into investment trends in the market, capital flows into carbon projects. Also quick to analyze CCPs, the impacts of them were published. But the one I'm going to talk about today is some work we did for VCMI, which looked at the potential impacts of using carbon credits as part of the decarbonisation journey. And obviously, the theme through many of the presentations today. All of that, those presentations, by the way, are on our website, troveresearch.com. And we also do public-facing webinars quarterly, very well attended. Next one on 23rd of April. So I'm not in the sales team. That's the end of this bit. Next part, please. Right, so our particular work for VCMI, effectively it was to investigate the climate outcomes of using carbon credits alongside decarbonisation. And we approached that in 4 steps. The first thing was to draw on our universe of data to quantify the gap between where companies currently are with their emissions and where they should be or could be if they're on track with their targets. So I'll explain that a little more. The other part of it was to look at what behavior we might see in the market if carbon credits could be used to close that gap. And again, I'll explain the thinking there. But, as Stephen said, qualitatively, we hear from firms that carbon credits are seen as an important tool to accelerate decarbonisation. We try to quantify that. We then worked through various scenarios and calculated the potential climate outcomes of this sort of approach, into volume and dollar terms. And where this went through the VCMI is supporting their Scope 3 flexibility plan, which I'll touch on at the end. But in short, what we found was that using carbon credits as part of decarbonisation reduces the overall cost of action in a given year, and that in turn can lead to more firms setting ambitious climate targets and increase the overall amount of decarbonisation happening. So this built on our corporate data from across a huge universe. I think one of the things we're all conscious of in this industry is there's always a risk of having sort of implicit bias in your sample sizes, particularly where they're small. And what we try and do is take a really broad view of corporate activity across the world. There's maybe 3 sets of companies which go into the universe for us. The first is publicly listed companies. And MSCI, as an index and benchmark provider originally, got really strong heritage in this. They're what's called that IMI, the All Countries World Index Investable Markets, effectively represents the largest listed companies in the world. And Our teams and their teams have collected data, the disclosed data, got model data as well, but the disclosed data for these companies across a massive set, more than 10,000. We also track companies who sign up to SBTI. Many of them are these publicly listed companies, but some of them are smaller or they're private, so they fall outside of that universe. But obviously an important set for all of us to consider, companies setting those science-aligned sort of targets. And then in particular, we draw on private companies as a group in themselves. And this again is a real focus for MSCI. There's lots of interest into the role that private companies can play in the transition. So huge set of data, 15,000 companies, I guess, in total now. And across all of the data sets, bits relevant to this report were the emissions, baseline year, Scope 1, 2, and 3, and a 5-year period at the time. As I say, we use the disclosed data. My team and MSCI's team trawling through annual reports and using AI to try and extract all of that information. Hard game, but important, I think, to get disclosed data where we can. We also have the target data for those companies, and what is of use to this research was the net zero emission reduction targets. Then we also capture renewable energy, carbon neutral, and the claims. And of course, we have all of the corporate credit use, which is fed into several of our reports and projections for the future. But emissions and targets is what was used for here. Click, please. So I always like a diagram. This is conceptually what we're trying to do with this report. For each company in the universe, we were trying to compare their emissions, sort of latest disclosed emissions, to where they should be if they were following their target. So, of course, we have where disclosed, the baseline year. And obviously, if you go back in time, I think anyone who's looked at this data will know that boundaries have changed, etc. So sometimes it's hard to get a good baseline number for these companies, but certainly wherever we could, we took that value. We obviously have their latest disclosed emissions from their company reports and so on. And then we looked at their targets and we said conceptually, if this was their baseline and this is where they're trying to get to, where roughly should they be at this point on their journey? And we looked at the gap, sometimes an overperformance or an over delivery, sometimes an underperformance as shown by the orange arrows here. And we also did the same thing with a Paris-aligned pathway. So if this company's targets that doesn't meet the sort of Paris-aligned reduction, what if it did? Where would they be there? I think that so that gave us a gap now. And then we also projected that gap forwards out to 2030. So, as Andrea says, with any modeling, pinch of salt here, but it at least sort of frame the scale of the problem. And so if things continue as they are today, how far apart might this, or how far away might this company be from its target? What's the excess emission? If you click, please. So we took that information and applied that across the whole universe, and looking at the extent to which companies are off track or on track. And we did that for Scope 1 and 2, Scope 3, own target, 1.5 pathway, now in the future, all different combinations. And I won't go through all the details there. You can find them in the report. But if you click once more, please, summary of this information and quantifying the gap. So we found that for Scopes 1 and 2, there's currently a gap of 400 megatons between the real emissions and where they should be. They're on track with their own targets even. And by 2030, that could grow to 2 gigatons. And Scope 3, this is of particular interest to VCMI and their flexibility claim. We found a current gap of 1.3 gigatons between companies' Scope 3 emissions and where they should be, potentially growing to 7 gigatons in the future. So that 1.3 gigatons, put a mental bookmark in that, because that's a useful result. If you click again, please, the other side of this work was to look at, I suppose I guess modeling the impact that use of carbon credits might have on encouraging target setting. I think intuitively, we all know that when where costs of decarbonisation are higher, companies tend to set less action. And if costs could be reduced, I think it makes sense that companies might be more ambitious. Anecdotally, we know that's true, but I don't think anyone's ever tried to quantify that before. So hats off to Guy Turner, our MD, if you know him, dusted off his old behavioural economics hats there. The way we set out to do this is we looked at, firstly, the cost of abatement in each sector. And anyone who's worked with abatement costs knows they are fiendishly tricky, but we worked with a series of partners and experts and collated lots of sources to find at least a nominal abatement cost per sector. And then we tried to compare that to measures of climate ambition. And there were three which we compared to in this research. The first one was for each sector or industry, the number of companies setting SBTI targets with a simple measure. Perhaps more significant was for each sector, the percentage of their global market cap under SBTI. And that was something as MSCI with a big range of financial data we were able to do. I think that's a really important one for me. It feels quite meaningful. And the third thing we looked at was what was called the implied temperature rise of those sectors. So for those of you who haven't heard that term before, ITR is a metric originally founded actually by MSCI, but in general used throughout the industry. And what it effectively says is if you look at a company and their targets, if the whole world behaved like this company, what would the temperature rise be? And I think this is a really useful metric because targets are complex. Any given company will have many milestones, different scopes, different reductions, and this flattens it out to something that can be compared between companies. And through this, I suppose, like what you see on the right-hand side, there certainly is a clear trend between the cost of decarbonisation and the amount of action that those sectors are taking. And what we infer from this is if the cost of action could be reduced, carbon credits is a relatively cheap form of action, are a way to do this. Perhaps we could see more targets being set, and it gives us a way to quantify that. If you click once more, please. What we had, so where we got to here is we know the size of the gap, in particular that scope 3 gap. We've got a formula for the way that reducing costs through carbon credits might encourage more target setting action. And they're also, as part of what VCMI was looking at, various conditions here, various guardrails. The results I'll show you got particular caveat. This isn't just for any company. This is for firms who have set SBTI targets, 1, 2, and 3, scope 1, 2, and 3. They're already on track to meet scopes 1 and 2. So these are companies who are ambitious. They've got demonstrable progress in scopes 1 and 2, but they're struggling with scope 3. And if we allow those companies to close the gap between where they'd like to be on scope 3 and where they are now, that could generate 640 megatons of carbon credits today. And if you click the value of that, looking for high quality credits, I think we'll all agree, however you assess it, integrity is important here, that could generate $19 billion of climate finance. That was from the gap side. And if you click please onto the next few lines, using the impact of or that interaction of credits and ambition, allowing credits in this way and reducing the cost of action this year might lead to 1,000 companies setting climate targets, $10 trillion in market cap. 400 of them we think would be SBTI aligned, and the cumulative effect on temperature rise could be a reduction of 0.5 degrees C. So of course, this is only a model. There's a lot of there's a big gap, of course, in complexity between the real world and a model. But interestingly, I think this certainly shows the scale of potential of more innovative approaches to using carbon credits. And very quickly, where VCMI have gone with this, they launched towards the end of last year a scope 3 flexibility claim. which proposes to allow the use of carbon credits in exactly the way I described. Lots of constraints to make sure they're used appropriately. As I say, would be on track for scope 1 and 2 in SBTI. You have to use high quality credits, so define them as CCP tagged. You also need to meet their foundational criteria, disclosing your emissions, undergoing third-party verification, etc. Anyway, they published this claim and it's being road tested this year. We were, I think, very happy to be involved in this research, drawing on our big database and huge offering, and supporting some innovative thinking in this industry. So we're excited to see where that goes. Yeah, thanks very much. I welcome questions on this and pass back to Andrea.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Right, time is a bit tight, so let's move straight to questions. I'm going to read one or two in the chat. I think we'll keep this to about 5 minutes because we do need time for the summary statement at the end, which I think is a really important part of this. So this is for the, I think it was the MSCI study. Let me just double check. Yes, it was. Okay, so the question is, surprised by the level of 100 tons CO2 per company. Would you have more elements on how this level was chosen? Is an increase contemplated? Average 100. Thanks, James.
Thanks. Very quick answer. Right, so what we were trying to eliminate here from the study was lots of companies have a small amount of carbon credits used to offset a conference, let's say. So we're trying to take out companies who just have nominal offsetting, and it was 100 tons or 5% of their total volume, with some materiality threshold. But we analysed that across a range of thresholds, used different numbers, different percents, and directionally the same result always held. But it's effectively trying to rule out companies who use just a tiny amount of credit, nothing significant.
Okay, great. Thank you. Stephen, this next one is for you. It's been seen repeatedly that companies using carbon credits voluntarily are in general leaders in climate action. But do you know if anyone has analysed potentially important differences in how these companies are using the credits?
Yeah, well, the Silvera report provides some good case study examples of specific companies and what their strategies are. But I think the question of how the companies are using the credits, the interpretation there could be pretty broad, but I would probably look at that in a couple of different ways. One is using it as part of a climate claim to be able to speak directly to their carbon footprint. Others would be maybe more on the other side, would be more of a philanthropic perspective of making that purchase as more of an investment into more of a global benefit versus a direct corporate benefit. And I think this is the kind of the nature of the biggest debate in the role of the voluntary carbon market. And what we hear very often from companies is that it cannot claim the credit as part of a climate goal. It will be pushed into the philanthropic budgets, which are very likely to be much smaller in the scale and potential for their investment into carbon markets. So that's why it's so critical for the work of VCMI and others to ensure that there is a way to count for these credits as part of climate strategies.
Yeah, and I think this next question is very aligned, but if anyone has a build on what Stephen's just said, Mark, I'm thinking you may have, please add it. But the question is there any report or data that shows the comparison of voluntary carbon markets and results-based payments in their performance in reducing emissions? I think this is important since in some countries, voluntary carbon market is antagonized and stakeholders claim results-based payment as the better path to reduce emissions. So any analysis comparing those two and the impact on emissions that anyone is aware of?
I'm afraid I'm not aware of any analysis that would I would be astonished if some didn't exist. I mean, obviously, carbon crediting projects are one form of results-based payment. Results-based payments are a much broader category of activities. And I would say that both can exist side by side. But as I say, I haven't seen any particular analysis on that.
Okay, another question. I'll put this to all. Can I ask whether presenters they think more widespread use of voluntary credits to meet compliance market obligations? So that could be like the carbon tax scheme in Colombia or South Africa, I guess, would improve the overall trajectory of the voluntary carbon market, I guess CORSIA as well, and resolve the end user problem that plagues these markets.
I can start on that, Andrea. So that's, yes, so the overlap of the voluntary and compliance markets are something that AlliedOffsets has been looking into a lot in the last few months. We are seeing more compliance schemes starting to use offsets or allow certain types of offsets. I think there is an opportunity for the voluntary market for this to almost bake in demand for credits. I think a lot of these schemes usually, I mean, particularly, for example, the California Air Resources Board compliance scheme, they often have additional checks on integrity and quality of these credits in place. And it also takes away some of the potential scrutiny that these companies might come up against in terms of why they chose specific credits that they did, for example. I think potentially the only downfall of this is that if you're just thinking purely on economic terms, you kind of bake in the carbon price at whatever the compliance price is. So currently, for most of the VCM projects, the voluntary price is lower, but as demand increases in the market, that might shift a bit.
Thank you. I'm just scanning the questions. I don't see any others that are very specific to the context of this webinar in terms of sort of research to try and understand demand dynamics. So I will keep a lookout. If any more come in, I will add them. But I think, Mark, if we could move now on to the statement that we all worked on, and then I'll let people know where they can find that statement and how they can engage with it.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Andrea. And thanks to the presenters today. I think everyone will agree that there is an increasing and growingly rich body of analysis and evidence that looks at the interplay between global emissions, corporate action on climate change, and the role of voluntary carbon markets or carbon credits more generally as part of corporate net zero transitions. As well as this being a rich set of data, you will have heard a lot of numbers today, which I know is difficult for everyone to take away. So we've been working over the last few weeks to provide a summary of the information that you've received and some actions that we believe that should derive from those pieces of evidence, and we'll run through those in a minute. They, as Andrea mentioned, will be available via the QR code and on the IETA website, and we will be posting them on social media. I think it's obvious that with all the evidence that we've heard, and as both Andrea and many of the speakers have mentioned, these are modeling exercises. They are not designed to say this is the exact answer in terms of how many credits or how much demand there will be in a given year. But what we have seen, and the reason we were able to generate the summary statement that you're about to see, is that they are all push in the same direction. And if I go back to the question that I laid out at the very beginning of today's session, is it possible, and if so, how can we stimulate additional private sector investment through voluntary carbon markets in emissions reductions and removals around the world in a way that also drives and incentivizes deeper corporate decarbonization? I think a lot of what we've seen today suggests that not only is it necessary, but it's also very much possible if we create the right rules, build trust, and therefore engender scale across both decarbonization investments and carbon markets. So if we could move to the statement slide, please. I'm going to read through these because I think it's important that we capture these key messages. So number one, across all the studies, despite the excellent work that SBTI and other target setting initiatives have done to recruit companies to set targets that are aligned with net zero in the Paris Agreement, still 80% of the world's largest listed companies do not have Paris-aligned targets. Let's not forget, we've been negotiating climate change for 36 years now. International negotiations started in 1988. And one would have expected, given the urgency of the problem, that all countries, all sectors, and all companies would have Paris-aligned targets. Yet 80% of the largest listed companies, this doesn't include the corner shop or the pub, these are large listed companies, do not yet have targets. If those targets, that 80% of largest listed companies, did set Paris-aligned targets for scope 1 and 2 emissions alone, that's to say emissions directly within their control and consumption of electricity, we would be able to reduce emissions by a further 4 gigatons of CO2e. That's nearly 10% of global emissions, just with those targets. And that would get us on a track much closer to 1.5, certainly below 2 degrees, compared to the 2.5 degree trajectory that the world is currently on. So as a result, we urge all companies, first and foremost, to set Paris-aligned reduction targets. That's both a net zero commitment and short-term targets aligned with that net zero commitment. Even for those companies that do have net zero reduction pathways and targets, their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and this is setting aside for the moment the difficulty that we know companies have with scope 3 emissions, but just for scope 1 and 2 emissions, emissions have been higher than where they should be on an estimated trajectory to 2030 by close to 20%, by around 19% a year. That means that if this underperformance continues, i.e. they don't course correct and get their emissions back on track, emissions could be 1.5 to 2.5 gigatons higher than they should be in 2030. And that takes us further off track, both 1.5 and 2 degree trajectories. So obviously an urge there is for companies, first, set targets, but second, those who have targets, and when they are setting targets, make sure that they are on track. And as much as possible, decarbonize internally, but then where it is not possible to decarbonize, to use voluntary carbon markets to remain Paris-aligned. And then we turn to scope 3 emissions. And as we know, we've seen from the evidence today, a vast majority of companies are not on track for their scope 3 targets. And that's within the very small select group of companies that have set scope 3 targets. And as was pointed out in the MSCI presentation, if for scope 3, even for those companies that are on track for on scopes 1 and 2, and that is a subset of all those that have targets, if they made their best efforts to reduce emissions, this is not just about saying, I can't be bothered, it's too difficult, I buy a bunch of carbon credits. This is companies that are making genuine best efforts to reduce their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And if they close the gap or bridge the gap using high quality carbon credits, then we would create an additional demand of 640 megatons. And that, to put it in context, is 2.5 times the size of the voluntary carbon market today. So there's a significant increase in investment and therefore reductions in removals. And therefore we urge companies to set scope 3 targets in line with the science in Paris, make every effort to achieve them. Engage with suppliers, engage up and down the value chain, look for emissions reductions and removal opportunities within the value chain, but then having made those best efforts, to use voluntary carbon markets to close the gaps. It's not acceptable to say, I've tried my best, can't do anything else. There's a responsibility to bridge that gap using carbon credits. And what we've seen, and this goes to the question I asked about how is it possible, and if so, how to both drive decarbonisation by companies and incentivize use of carbon markets, we've seen from various pieces of evidence across all the presentations we've heard today that most companies do not see use of carbon credits or investment in carbon markets as a way out of their responsibilities, of a get out of jail free. Companies that are engaging with voluntary carbon markets are, on average, better performers on reducing emissions, set more ambitious targets, have better internal governance. In other words, it is possible for deep decarbonisation and engagement with voluntary carbon markets to go hand in hand. And I think that's a key message we should take away from today. So, Andrea, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I hope you find that useful to draw those summary findings from across all the research studies. This summary statement is now live as of right now. It'll be posted in the chat from Lynn. I see it's there now, so thank you very much, Lynn. And if you could share that, there's a link to the LinkedIn post on that as well. Before we close entirely, I'd like to remind you that IETA has a summit in Italy, the European Climate Summit, on the 16th to 18th of April. On the 16th, we will be launching the guidelines I spoke about earlier. This is the guidelines for the high integrity use of credits to do all the things we've been talking about today: raise ambition, close gaps, de-risk our climate delivery. So those will be shared at the European Climate Summit, launched on the 16th, and in a panel on the 17th. A recording of this webinar will be available on the IETA website in a few days' time. There will be a second version of this webinar later on today at 3 p.m. UK time, should you have colleagues who would like to watch it. And that really covers everything we wanted to say. So thank you very much to the panel members. Thank you for all your extensive research and for our ability in the market to draw on this wealth of work. Thank you for collaborating and working together so that we can jointly come out with summary statements. I think it's so important. Thank you very much to all of you. We had a record number of people joining this webinar, so really great to have you all. And sorry we couldn't get through all the questions, but we tried our best to cover as many of them as possible. So thank you very, very much. Good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You all.